The call came late, just as I was getting ready to head home. My partner Dan and I had already put in a solid 10-hour shift fixing up a few busted track sensors. But dispatch was insistent. Something about a weird power surge in the old Yellow Line tunnel. It was supposed to have been shut down for good 5 years ago. Probably just some rats chewing wires, Dan grumbled as he pulled up his jacket. I agreed. Seemed like the usual nuisance. Still, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling as we loaded up the truck. The drive to the entrance was uneventful. Quiet streets, dark alleys, the kind of vibe that always makes you feel like you're being watched. We parked near the boarded up entrance, hauled out our gear, and pried open the rusted gate. The stale, musty air hit me like a slap in the face. "Smells like death," Dan muttered, laughing nervously. I forced a chuckle too, though I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The tunnel was pitch black except for our flashlights. The usual hum of the subway was missing. No trains, no passengers, no life, just silence, and something else. A faint hum in the distance, like static. The farther we walked, the worse it got. The air grew colder, and that hum got louder, almost like whispers. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone or something was watching us. But every time I turned, the tunnel was empty. "You hear that?" Dan asked, stopping dead in his tracks. "Hear what?" I replied, though I knew exactly what he meant. "The whispers, like voices." His flashlight beam darted around, lighting up nothing but damp walls and rusty rails. We kept going, our boots crunching on the gravel. About 200 yards in, the power flickered. Just once, enough to make us freeze. In that brief moment of light, I swear I saw something. A shadow, maybe? It was there, and then it wasn't. "Did you see that?" I whispered. But Dan just shook his head. "You're just spooking yourself." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The whispers grew louder. Not words exactly, just sounds. And they weren't coming from behind us or ahead of us. They were coming from the walls. It felt like the tunnel itself was alive, like it was breathing. "Let's finish this and get out of here," Dan said, his voice a bit shaky. We reached the source of the surge, an old control box hanging off the wall, wires spilling out like guts. As Dan crouched to inspect it, the lights flickered again. This time, the power stayed on a little longer, and I saw it. A figure. It stood about 10 feet away, just off the tracks. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, they were empty, hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. The lights flickered off again. When they came back, the figure was closer. I could see its face more clearly now, a twisted, agonized expression as if it had died screaming. Dan finally looked up and froze. "What the hell?" he whispered. The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. My flashlight flickered on and I swept the beam around frantically. The figure was gone. "Run," I said, my voice trembling. Dan didn't argue. We took off down the tracks, our footsteps echoing through the tunnel. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and then we heard it. A low guttural moan that sent shivers down my spine. I turned back just for a second. Big mistake. The figure was following us. No, not walking. Gliding. Its feet didn't touch the ground, and it was fast. Too fast. We reached the side of the tunnel and ducked in, pressing ourselves against the wall. I killed my flashlight, hoping the darkness would hide us. The whispers stopped. The tunnel was silent again, except for the sound of our heavy breathing. Did we lose it? Dan whispered. But before I could answer, the lights flickered on again. The figure stood at the entrance of the side tunnel, staring at us with those empty eyes. It raised one hand, pointing straight at us. The figure opened its mouth, and the whispers came pouring out, louder than ever. It wasn't just one voice, it was dozens, maybe hundreds, all screaming, crying, begging. And then it spoke. You don't belong here, it said, its voice echoing inside my head. I grabbed Dan and pulled him to his feet. The figure tilted its head, almost like it was amused. Then it started moving towards us again. We ran. I don't know how we found our way back to the main tunnel, but we did. The whispers followed us, growing fainter the farther we got. When we finally burst out of the tunnel and into the cold night air, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. Dan sat beside me, his face pale and his hands shaking. We didn't speak. What could we say? The next day we reported the incident to our supervisor. He just laughed and said we must have been imagining things. Too much time in the dark, he said. But I know what I saw. What we saw. That tunnel isn't abandoned. Not really. Something lives down there, and it doesn't want to be disturbed. I don't know if I'll ever step foot in another subway tunnel again. But if I do, I'll make damn sure it's not the yellow line. And if you're ever working late and you hear whispers in the walls, don't go back. The call came through around 3:30 p.m., just as Jake and I were packing up for the day. A communication tower in the deep western sector of the park had gone offline. Normally it wouldn't be our problem, but the Forest Service was understaffed and we were the closest rangers available. Why do these things always happen at the end of a shift? Jake muttered, tossing his hat into the cab of the truck. I didn't bother answering. Complaining was Jake's specialty, but he'd still suit up and do his job. We both would. We loaded our gear, grabbed the maps, and set off. The forest was huge, miles and miles of dense trees, steep hills, and winding trails. It wasn't a place you wanted to get lost, and yet, plenty of people did. Over the years, there'd been rumors about the western sector. Hikers who vanished without a trace. Campers who left their gear behind but were never found. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but I didn't like the idea of being out there after dark either. The drive took over an hour, and by the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon. We'd have maybe 2 hours of daylight left to hike in, fix the tower, and get back out. We'll be fine, Jake said as we set off. Quick in and out, easy money. But the forest didn't feel right. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind. Just the crunch of our boots and the occasional rustle of leaves as we brushed past low-hanging branches. Ever notice how weird this place feels? I asked, trying to break the silence. Jake just shrugged. Just a bunch of trees, man. Don't psych yourself out. About 2 miles in, we came to the tower, or what was left of it. The base was intact, but the upper sections had been twisted, like some giant had grabbed it and wrung it like a wet towel. Storm damage? Jake guessed, though he didn't sound convinced. Maybe, I said, pulling out my toolkit. We got to work, but it was slow going. The tower's wiring was completely fried, and most of our equipment wasn't up to the job. While Jake fiddled with a busted panel, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a shadow darting between the trees. I thought maybe it might be a deer, but it didn't feel like a deer. The shadow had moved too fast, too silently, and there was that gnawing feeling in my gut, like we weren't alone. We worked in silence for another hour, the sun sinking lower and lower. The shadows stretched long and deep, and the forest seemed to come alive. The trees, they felt closer, like they were leaning in, watching us. "Jake, this place is creeping me out," I said, glancing around. "Almost done," he replied, though his voice sounded a bit tight, like he was forcing himself to stay calm. And then we heard it. A low, mournful sound, like wind through a hollow log. Except there was no wind. The air was completely still. Jake froze, his hands hovering over the panel. What the hell was that? Before I could answer, the sound came again, louder this time, and closer. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the trees, but the beams only seemed to make the shadows deeper. That's when we noticed it. The trees weren't where they'd been before. "I swear that oak wasn't there earlier," Jake said. He was right. The trees were shifting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving, closing in. "Pack up," I said, my voice starting to shake. "We're leaving now." Jake didn't argue. We grabbed our tools and started back the way we'd come. But the trail was gone. The trees had swallowed it. This isn't possible," Jake stammered, spinning in circles. "We didn't go off the path." "Keep moving," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The forest grew darker, colder. Our flashlights barely cut through the gloom, and the sound came again, closer, louder. It wasn't wind. It was a voice, low, whispering, calling. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded. "Just keep moving." But the trees seemed to stretch on forever. An endless maze. Every step felt like we were being pulled deeper into the heart of the forest. And that's when we saw it. A figure. It stood between the trees, tall and thin, its body shrouded in mist. Its face, if you could call it a face, was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers. We both looked at each other and then started running. Branches tore at our clothes and scratched our faces as we pushed through the underbrush. The figure didn't follow us, not at first, but the whispers did, growing louder, more insistent. It was hard to make out the voices, but it seemed like they were saying stay. Then the figure appeared again, ahead of us this time. It didn't walk, it glided, its form flickering like a candle flame. Jake screamed and veered left, crashing through the brush. I followed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. When we finally stopped, we were in a small clearing. The figure was gone, but the whispers lingered, circling us like vultures. "What the hell is it?" Jake asked. But I didn't have an answer. All I knew is that we were trapped. The forest wouldn't let us go. The sun was completely gone now, and the darkness was absolute. Our flashlights flickered, their beams weakening. And then we saw them. Not one figure, but many. Dozens of them, standing silently among the trees, their glowing eyes watching us. The figures didn't move, they just watched, and then one by one, they stepped closer. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of Jake screaming, the feel of cold hands grabbing at me, and then nothing. I woke up at dawn laying on the forest floor. Jake was gone. The figures were gone. Even the trees seemed normal again. I stumbled back to the truck, my mind racing. No one believed me when I told them what happened. They said Jake must have gotten lost, that he probably wandered off in the dark. But I know the truth. Something lives in that forest, and it's always watching. It started as a routine job, just another day on the clock, climbing poles and splicing wires out in the middle of nowhere. The call came in from dispatch around 8:30 a.m. Reports of spotty phone service in a remote stretch of the county. Probably some squirrels chewing on the lines, they said. Easy enough, I told Chris, my partner. He grunted in agreement, sipping his coffee. Neither of us thought much of it, just a quick in-and-out fix before lunch. We loaded up the truck and headed out to the site. The road was long and winding, cutting through dense forest. By the time we reached the troubled spot, there wasn't another soul in sight. No houses, no cars, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The first sign something was off came about an hour in. Chris was up on the pole checking the lines while I manned the ground. "You hear that?" He called down, looking over his shoulder. "Hear what?" I asked. "That sound, like static." I tilted my head, straining to listen. Sure enough, there was something faint, like the hiss of a poorly tuned radio, distant and uneven. "Probably interference," I said, trying to sound confident. "Could be a nearby tower acting up." Chris frowned, but went back to work. I didn't admit it at the time, but the sound bothered me. It wasn't constant. It pulsed, like it had a rhythm, like it was alive. We finished patching the line, but the signal didn't go away. If anything, it got louder. When we hooked up our diagnostic gear, the static blasted through the speaker. It was deafening, almost angry. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, adjusting the dials. The static shifted, almost like it was responding to him. Then, buried deep beneath the noise, we heard what sounded like a voice. At first, it was just a whisper, faint, like someone talking underwater. We leaned closer, straining to make out the words. "Find it," the voice said. "Come closer." Chris jumped back, nearly dropping the speaker. "What the hell was that?" I don't know," I stammered, and my hands were beginning to shake. "Maybe a crossed signal?" "From what? There's nothing out here." He was right. We were miles from the nearest town, with no towers or antennas in sight. But the voice was clear, and it was calling to us. Against my better judgment, I suggested we trace the source. Part of me wanted to turn and call it a day, but another part, curiosity maybe, pushed me forward. Chris was hesitant, but he eventually agreed. We packed up our tools and started driving deeper into the woods, following the static. The road turned to dirt, then to gravel, then to nothing but a pair of faint tire tracks cutting through the trees. The signal grew stronger with every mile, the voice growing louder, more insistent. "Keep going," it said. "Almost there." By mid-afternoon, we came to a clearing. In the center stood an old radio tower, rusted and overgrown. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. "Why is there a tower all the way out here?" Chris asked, his voice a bit tight. "I don't know," I admitted. "It's not on any of our maps." The static was almost unbearable now, a constant roar that seemed to rattle my teeth. We stepped out of the truck, and that's when I felt it. A pressure, like the air itself was pushing down on me. My head throbbed, and the edges of my vision blurred. Chris grabbed his temple. "You feel that?" I nodded, unable to speak. We approached the tower cautiously, our boots crunching on the gravel. The voice was louder now, but it wasn't coming from the radio. It was in our heads. "Closer," it said. "You must see." Chris stopped suddenly, his face pale. "I don't think we should be here," he said, his voice trembling. I wanted to agree, but something kept pulling me forward. I couldn't stop. The voice was like a hook in my brain, dragging me closer with every step. At the base of the tower, we found a hatch. It was rusted shut, but Chris pried it open with a crowbar. A ladder descended into darkness. "Nope," Chris said, backing away. "I'm not going down there." But the voice was relentless now, pounding in my skull. "Down," it commanded. "You must come." Without thinking, I grabbed the flashlight and started climbing. Chris cursed under his breath, but followed. The ladder led to a small control room, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Old equipment lined the walls, switchboards, monitors, dials, all covered in dust. But one screen was on, displaying nothing but static. As we stepped inside, the hatch slammed shut above us. The bulb burned brighter for a moment, then burst, plunging us into darkness. "Chris!" I shouted, fumbling with my flashlight. The beam flicked on, illuminating the room, but Chris wasn't there. "Chris?" I called again, my voice cracking. The static on the screen shifted, and his face appeared. He was screaming, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me!" he cried, his voice distorted. "It's in my head!" I backed against the wall, my heart hammering. The screen flickered, and Chris's face was replaced by something else. A figure. Its form was vague, shifting, like smoke caught in a windstorm. "Stay," it said, its voice layered with countless others. "You belong here." "You cannot leave," it said, its form growing larger, darker. "The signal binds you." I bolted for the ladder, my flashlight clattering to the ground as I climbed. The voice screamed in my head, a cacophony of commands and threats. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally burst out into the clearing, the forest was deathly silent. The truck was gone, and so was the tower. I stumbled through the woods for hours before I found the road. A passing car picked me up and took me to the nearest ranger station. No one believed me when I told them what happened. They say Chris must have just taken the truck and left me there. But that's a lie. And I know the truth. If you ever hear a signal out there in the forest, don't follow it.